Estella had always been a curious girl, the kind that spent hours in the backyard imagining palaces in the sand and pretending to be a princess from faraway lands. Her world, though modest, was rich in dreams. But on that particular day, those dreams turned into a nightmare. From the moment she opened her eyes that morning, something felt off. The air in the house was different, too quiet, too heavy. A large suitcase sat on the living room floor, half open, with some of her clothes already packed. Her mother, Mary, moved through the house with a rehearsed smile and eyes that refused to meet her daughter's gaze. Estella, only 13 but already sharp enough to sense tension, asked repeatedly what was happening, but her parents only responded with vague phrases like, "You're going to love this trip," or "Trust us, it's your dream coming true." Her dream? She didn't remember ever dreaming about something that made her chest hurt like this. That afternoon, without warning, they were at the airport, passports in hand, heading to a place she had only read about in old storybooks, the Middle East. The whole journey felt surreal. Her parents insisted she had been chosen for something extraordinary, but they refused to explain further. And so, wrapped in confusion, fear, and a strange sense of foreboding, Estella boarded the plane with tears in her eyes and her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. Something was deeply wrong. She felt it in her bones, but no one seemed willing to say it out loud. By the time they arrived, the sheer opulence of the place stunned her. Golden gates, intricate architecture, fountains that danced with light. It was all too grand, too unreal. They were welcomed by men in long robes who spoke a language she barely understood, though a few familiar words reached her from time to time. Her parents acted differently here, more formal, more obedient. They called the men "sir" and bowed their heads slightly when they spoke. Estella couldn't understand why, but she noticed how her father's shoulders tensed every time a man named Yusuf walked by. After a few days, it became clear they weren't on vacation. She wasn't allowed to leave the premises. The guards said it was for her safety. Her questions were dismissed. "You'll see," Mary would whisper, fixing Estella's hair in front of the ornate mirror in their room. Then came the night of the banquet, the special event, as her father called it. Estella was dressed in a pristine white gown, her makeup done by strangers, her long hair styled in a way that made her feel like a porcelain doll. As she stood at the top of the grand staircase, she looked down at the crowd gathered in the castle garden, and panic began to rise in her chest. That's when it hit her. This wasn't a party. It was a selection. And she was one of the candidates. The others were girls her age, dressed like brides, seated beside eager-looking parents. Her breath caught. Her knees felt weak. Something horrible was about to happen, and she didn't know how to stop it. Estella's mind raced as she descended the stairs. Every instinct screamed for her to turn around, to run, to scream, but her legs moved on their own, like she was being pulled by invisible strings. Her parents waited at the bottom, all smiles, pretending everything was normal. Her father extended a hand toward her as if proud to present a masterpiece. "You look stunning," he whispered, but his voice didn't carry the warmth it usually did. It felt cold, rehearsed. Estella noticed the way his fingers trembled slightly when he touched her arm. Around the garden, the crowd buzzed with polite conversation and low laughter, but none of it reached her ears. Her entire focus was on the man at the center of it all, the sheikh. He stood near the altar with his hands folded calmly in front of him, surrounded by advisors, watching everything with an unreadable expression. His name was Omar, Sheikh Omar, and he was much older than she had imagined. His hair was silver, his face worn by the years, and though he smiled faintly, there was something unsettling in how he observed each girl with such scrutiny. Estella's stomach turned. This was wrong. All of it. She was not a princess being courted. She was a child on display. Her eyes darted to the guards stationed around the garden. There was no way out. Her palms began to sweat as her parents gently guided her forward, their voices soothing, fake. Her mother leaned in close and whispered, "Just smile. You're going to be chosen. I know it." Estella wanted to scream. She had barely taken her seat when Sheikh Omar stepped up onto a small stage with his right-hand man, Yusuf, by his side. The sheikh spoke in Arabic, slowly and deliberately, and Yusuf translated for the audience in English. "Tonight," he announced, "I will choose the one who will become my wife, the future mother of my legacy." A chill ran down Estella's spine. The other girls sat silently, stiff in their chairs, some looking down at their laps, others glancing nervously at their parents. None smiled. None looked happy. They were all like her, trapped in this bizarre, surreal parade of innocence and wealth. Then, the procession began. The Sheikh and Yusuf moved from table to table. At each stop, the parents would boast about their daughters, their obedience, their beauty, their purity. It made Estella sick to her stomach. She watched in horror as one girl was asked to remove her shoes so the Sheikh could inspect her feet. He rejected her with a single dismissive wave of his hand. Another girl was asked to recite something in Arabic. She stuttered, rejected, and then, slowly, inevitably, they reached Estella's table. Her heart pounded so violently she feared it would burst out of her chest. Her father stood proudly. "My daughter is special," he said. "She's respectful, beautiful, speaks some Arabic, and she's always dreamed of being part of your world." Her mother chimed in, echoing the same words, almost like a script. Estella opened her mouth to protest, but before she could, the Sheikh leaned forward and slowly lifted the hem of her dress to look at her feet. His face froze. Then, something completely unexpected happened. His eyes filled with tears. The shift in Sheikh Omar's expression was so abrupt that even Yusuf blinked in surprise. The crowd quieted, sensing something unusual was happening. Omar stared at Estella's foot, then at her face, as if trying to confirm something he had long suspected. Slowly, he stood up and in a voice that trembled slightly, announced, "She is the one." Yusuf translated, and immediately Mary and Ricardo erupted in celebration. They hugged each other, beaming with pride, their plan having worked perfectly. Estella, on the other hand, stood frozen. Nothing made sense. What was it about her that made the Sheikh so emotional? Why was she the only one who brought tears to his eyes? The rest of the evening was a blur. Her parents were ushered into lavish guest rooms within the castle. Servants delivered trays of exotic food and silk garments. Estella was barely spoken to. Everyone treated her as if she was now part of something sacred. She wasn't allowed to leave her quarters. Guards stood outside her door, for her protection. She tried to run once, then again the next morning, but both times she was intercepted. Ricardo laughed off her rebellion as jitters, while Mary kept brushing her hair and telling her how lucky she was. "You were born for isso," she would say in her broken Portuguese-English mix. Estella, however, didn't feel lucky. She felt like a bird locked in a golden cage. Her pleas were ignored, her protests dismissed. Each passing hour brought her closer to a fate she couldn't escape: marriage to a man more than 5 times her age. A man who had chosen her, not for love, but for some mysterious reason no one had explained. The day of the wedding arrived like a storm, unwanted, unavoidable, and overwhelming. The castle grounds buzzed with activity. Musicians tuned their instruments. Florists scattered petals along the aisle. Guests in embroidered robes and sparkling gowns filled the decorated garden. It looked like a fairy tale to everyone except the bride. Estella sat silently as servants dressed her in an extravagant gown adorned with diamonds and golden threads. The veil was heavy, the tiara even more so. Her reflection in the mirror was that of a stranger. Elegant, yes, but broken. When she was led toward the ceremony space, her feet dragged, her hands trembled, and her throat felt like it was closing. At the altar, Sheikh Omar waited with a solemn expression. For the first time, he looked at her not as an object, but as a person. As she reached the final steps, he bent down to her level and asked in the softest voice she'd heard from him, "Why are you crying?" The question caught her off guard. For a moment, she considered staying silent, like her parents expected her to. She glanced back at them, Mara smiling widely, Ricardo nodding with pride, but something inside her cracked. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was fear, or maybe, for once, she felt seen. In a small, shaking voice, she whispered, "I don't want to marry you." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Omar smiled. He stood tall and turned to face the crowd. His voice rang out clearly, translated by Yusuf, "There will be no wedding today." The announcement struck the gathering like thunder. A stunned silence fell over the guests, followed by murmurs of confusion and disbelief. Estella's eyes widened. She didn't know if she had just been saved or if a new punishment was coming. Mary stood up, panic already twisting her features. "She will marry you," she shouted, ignoring the decorum of the event. "She's our daughter, and we gave our blessing." Ricardo quickly followed, his voice sharp with rising desperation. "You promised a dowry. She's yours. Don't let her childish talk ruin everything." Estella felt her knees buckle, But Omar raised his hand calmly, and the guards instantly stepped forward. "Enough," he commanded. Yusuf's voice echoed the word for all to hear. Everyone froze. Omar's eyes never left Estela. "I never wanted a wife," he said slowly, each word weighed down by years of pain. "I wanted to find someone who was taken from me long ago." Confusion filled Estela's face. She turned toward her parents, but their expressions had already turned cold and defensive. Omar then turned to Yusuf and nodded. The loyal advisor opened a small leather folder he had been holding and removed a photo, one that showed a baby with a faint, crescent-shaped birthmark on her foot. "This," the sheikh said, "was my granddaughter." Gasps filled the garden. Estela's heart skipped a beat. She looked down at her own foot, hidden beneath the heavy fabric of her dress, and then back up at Omar. "My daughter," he continued, "left this land many years ago. She was young, in love, and pregnant. I was proud then. Too proud. I disowned her. I thought she'd return someday, but she never did. I only learned later that she died in a car accident in Brazil. I traced every step she took, and eventually I found the other car involved. A drunk couple. They survived. And the baby? Gone. Disappeared." Yusuf translated each word carefully, and Estela felt the crowd watching her, their eyes wide with emotion and curiosity. Omar stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper now. "That baby was you." Estela shook her head in disbelief, her mind unable to process the truth. It couldn't be. Her parents, Mara and Ricardo, were con artists, sure, but they couldn't have stolen her. Could they? She turned to look at them. For a split second, Mary's mask slipped. Guilt flickered in her eyes, followed by fury. "This proves nothing," Ricardo snapped. "She's ours. We raised her." But Omar was prepared. He gestured again, and one of his guards brought forward a sealed document. "DNA test," Yusuf announced. "Conclusive. She is blood of my blood." Estela's world tilted. She had come to this place a prisoner, thinking she was being sold. Now she was discovering she had never even known who she truly was. The truth hit Estela like a wave she hadn't seen coming. She stood there, silent and trembling, while the guests whispered among themselves and the tension in the air grew unbearable. Her so-called parents didn't deny it anymore. They didn't cry, didn't show shame, only frustration, like a business deal had just gone south. Ricardo stepped forward, eyes locked on the sheikh with defiance. "Fine," he spat. "She's your granddaughter. Take her. But don't pretend you can erase the years we spent feeding her, clothing her, putting a roof over her head. We deserve something." Mary nodded furiously. "We raised her. We gave her everything. She owes us." It was then that Estela understood. These people had never loved her. They had calculated her, like an asset in a portfolio, a long-term investment. Her knees buckled and she dropped onto the white carpet laid down for the wedding procession. Tears streamed down her face, not from sadness, but from a hollow, soul-crushing realization. She had never truly belonged to them. Every kind word, every forced smile, every birthday celebration was just part of a scam. She looked at Omar, not as a stranger anymore, but as a man who might actually care. His eyes were still filled with tears, and he reached down, gently lifting her up from the floor with the tenderness she had never received from Mary or Ricardo. "You owe them nothing," he said softly but firmly. Without a single word, Sheikh Omar signaled his guards. They disappeared briefly and returned moments later with a small, ornate chest. He opened it himself and took out 2 thick, gleaming gold bars. Estela stared at them, stunned. The room fell silent once again. He handed them to Ricardo without ceremony. "This is for the years you claim to have spent raising her," Omar said with steel in his voice. "It's more than enough. Take it, and leave. You are never to see her again." Ricardo's eyes lit up. He weighed the bars in his hands like a man who had just won the lottery. Mary, unable to help herself, whispered something under her breath about it not being enough, but Omar didn't even glance at her. His attention was entirely on Estela now. The guards formed a perimeter around her former guardians and began escorting them away. Estela didn't look back. She didn't need to. Their presence had already begun to feel like a bad dream fading in the morning light. For the first time in her life, she wasn't scared of what came next. The crowd, once murmuring and judgmental, now watched in stunned silence, many of them wiping their eyes. Omar knelt once more before Estela, this time not as a ruler or a wealthy man, but as a grandfather who had waited a lifetime to make things right. "You are safe now," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of everything unspoken. "I promise, from this day on, you will only know love, truth, and freedom." Estella didn't respond with words. She simply nodded, and in that moment, something inside her finally exhaled. After the chaos subsided, the guests quietly dispersed, still murmuring about the night's shocking revelations. The garden, once a stage for a twisted ceremony, now felt strangely peaceful. Estella remained close to Omar, her small hand clenched tightly in his. Everything had changed in a matter of hours. She was no longer a bargaining chip, no longer the daughter of grifters. She was a granddaughter of someone powerful, yes, but more importantly, of someone who finally saw her, not as a prize, but as a person. The weight of her dress began to feel unbearable, like a symbol of everything she had just escaped. Noticing her discomfort, Omar gently asked a maid to bring something more comfortable for her to wear. When Estella returned moments later in a simple white tunic, barefoot, hair down, she felt more herself than she had in years. She looked at her reflection in one of the castle's tall windows and barely recognized the girl who had arrived. That girl had been filled with confusion, fear, and quiet desperation. This new reflection, though still shaken, had hope shining through the cracks. It was faint, but it was there. Omar watched her with quiet reverence. "You remind me so much of her," he said softly. "Your mother." Estella didn't know how to respond. The image of her mother had always been a mystery. Nothing but stories Mary and Ricardo had fed her. Now, hearing that name from someone who truly knew her mother felt like finding a piece of herself that had been missing all along. Later that evening, long after the garden lights had dimmed and the guests had gone, Omar invited Estella to sit with him in the castle's library. It was a room full of dark wood, towering shelves, and warm lamps that gave it a golden glow. He spoke gently, never pressing, just sharing fragments of the past. He told her about his daughter, how she had defied his wishes, fallen in love with a humble man, and how he had let his pride destroy their bond. Estella listened, absorbing every word like they were drops of truth she had been thirsty for her entire life. "I spent years believing I was right," he confessed, his voice raspy. "But all I did was push away the people I loved." Estella, still fragile, reached out and placed her hand on his. It was the first time she initiated touch. "Do you think she would have liked me?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Omar smiled and a tear rolled down his cheek. "She would have adored you," he said. "You have her fire, her heart, her courage." That moment, quiet and tender, planted the seed of something that had never taken root before in Estella's life: belonging. For the first time, she wasn't just reacting to things happening to her. She was starting to imagine a future, one where her choices mattered, where her identity wasn't handed to her by selfish people, but discovered slowly, piece by piece, with someone who genuinely wanted to protect her. And though she didn't yet know what that future would look like, for the first time, she was ready to find out. In the days that followed, Estella began to experience what real freedom felt like, though it came with its own kind of confusion. No longer confined, no longer under surveillance, she was allowed to explore the castle and its surroundings at her own pace. There were no orders barked at her, no fake smiles or subtle manipulations. Instead, there were invitations. "Would you like to see the horses? Shall we take tea in the courtyard?" Her every yes or no was respected, something she wasn't used to. It was a strange adjustment. She found herself waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to snap and remind her that she was just a girl, that she didn't really matter. But it never came. The castle staff treated her with genuine warmth. The cook brought her special sweets and told her old stories. One of the guards taught her how to say her name in Arabic correctly. Even Yusuf, once a silent observer of her pain, began to smile at her when they crossed paths. Slowly, her shoulders stopped tensing every time someone called her name. And with each passing day, Estella felt something inside her shifting, a fragile but unmistakable sense of trust taking root. She still had questions, many, about her past, about her mother, about what her life was supposed to look like now. But for once, she had time to ask them without fear. The turning point came one morning when Estella found herself drawn to the room Omar had called his daughter's sanctuary. It had remained locked until that day. He handed her the key with trembling fingers and said, "Only if you're ready." She hesitated, the cool metal resting in her palm, then stepped inside. It was like walking into a preserved memory. The room smelled of jasmine and old paper. Delicate scarves hung over the windows, casting a warm pink light. Books lined the walls, poetry, politics, fairy tales. A music box sat on a small dresser, covered in dust. Estella wound it absent-mindedly, and a soft melody filled the space, one she felt like she'd heard in a dream. Her mother's presence was everywhere, though they had never met. In the photos on the wall, she saw eyes that mirrored her own, a smile that curved the same way. For the first time, the mystery of her origin didn't feel like a void. It felt like a lineage. She didn't cry. She didn't break down. Instead, she sat on the bed and closed her eyes, letting the melody surround her like a gentle embrace. When Omar joined her in the doorway, he didn't speak. He simply stood there, and together they grieved for what had been lost, and silently celebrated what had finally been found. Estella knew then that she wasn't just starting a new chapter. She was beginning her real story. Word of the dramatic non-wedding and its shocking revelation spread like wildfire across the region. Newspapers covered it with intrigue, blogs speculated, and even international media caught wind of the bizarre twist of fate. A billionaire sheikh who held a grand event to find a wife, only to discover his long-lost granddaughter among the candidates. The castle received a flood of calls, letters, and requests for interviews, but Omar turned them all down. "She's a child," he said firmly to every reporter who called. "She needs peace, not a spotlight." Estella overheard one of those conversations from behind a curtain and felt something clench in her chest. That was the first time someone had defended her without expecting something in return. She started journaling in her room, not because someone told her to, but because she needed to sort through the tangled mess of her thoughts. Every memory with Mary and Ricardo now felt contaminated, reframed in the harsh light of truth. She remembered times she had been punished for asking too many questions, or when she'd been denied simple pleasures like school trips or birthday parties, always with some excuse about money or safety. Now she saw it for what it was: control, grooming, keeping her small and isolated, so one day she would be easier to give away. Writing helped, but it didn't erase the pain. It just helped her start to name it, and that was a beginning. Omar, for his part, was learning how to be a grandfather, awkwardly but with an earnestness that softened everyone around him. He wasn't overly affectionate, but he tried. He asked about her favorite foods, her interests, even attempted to sit through a cartoon series she liked, though he fell asleep halfway through. Estella laughed for the first time in weeks when she caught him snoring on the couch with the remote still in his hand. It felt good to laugh again. He began showing her more of the castle and the lands around it. They visited the stables, the gardens, and even a nearby school where he said she could enroll if she wanted. "Only if you're ready," he repeated gently. He didn't push. He offered, and that was new. One evening, while walking through the citrus groves, Estella looked up at him and asked, "Why didn't you give up?" Omar stopped. "Because giving up would have meant accepting that my daughter and granddaughter were truly gone," he said, and my heart refused to believe that. Estella nodded, understanding something deeper than words. In this strange, complicated man who once made decisions she could never condone, she also saw someone desperately trying to atone. Someone choosing her, not for what she could offer, but for who she was. And that, more than the castle, more than the gold, was the true gift she had been given. One morning, Estella sat alone on a balcony overlooking the desert, the warm breeze brushing her hair as the sun climbed slowly above the dunes. It was peaceful, almost surreal. But even in that calm, memories still stirred. She thought about the moment she realized Mary and Ricardo weren't really her parents, not just in blood, but in love. That wound hadn't fully closed, and maybe it never would. Betrayal leaves scars, especially when it's from those you trusted most. She remembered how Ricardo used to ruffle her hair after dinner, how Mary would braid it before school. Were those gestures ever real? Or were they rehearsed? Part of the long con? She'd never know for sure, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. Yet, despite everything, a strange part of her still wished things had turned out differently. Not that she wanted to go back, but that she hadn't needed to be rescued in the first place, that her life hadn't been built on lies. But as she sat there, Omar stepped quietly onto the balcony and sat beside her without saying a word. He didn't ask her to talk. He didn't fill the silence. He just sat with her in it, and that simple gesture told her more than any speech ever could. In that silence, she didn't feel alone. She felt understood. Later that week, Estella asked to visit the nearby village, disguised, of course, under the careful watch of Yusuf and 2 guards. She wanted to walk through a normal marketplace, hear children laugh, smell food cooking in street stalls. She wanted, if only for an hour, to feel like a regular girl again. Omar agreed without hesitation. He even smiled at her insistence to wear jeans and a hoodie, her hair tucked into a cap. As they wandered the streets, Estella felt strangely free. No one recognized her. She bought a sweet pastry with honey and almonds, and the vendor treated her like any other teenager. That moment, small as it was, felt massive. For the first time, she wasn't a pawn or a princess or a victim. She was just Estella, a 13-year-old girl eating too much sugar and laughing too hard at a silly joke one of the guards made. And when she looked over her shoulder and saw Omar watching from a short distance, she saw not the powerful sheikh, but an old man learning how to love again, learning how to make up for lost time. When they returned to the castle that evening, she hugged him for the first time. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And though neither of them said anything in that moment, both understood what it meant. It was a silent promise. This is the start of something better. As the weeks passed, Estella began to build routines in the castle, not because anyone imposed them, but because she finally had the freedom to choose how she spent her time. She enrolled in private tutoring, determined to catch up on the education that had always been so inconsistent under Mare and Ricardo. For the first time, learning wasn't a burden or a form of control. It was a key, unlocking doors she never knew existed. She especially loved literature, drawn to stories about identity and belonging. Her favorite book was one about a girl who had been separated from her family and had to rediscover who she really was. The parallels weren't lost on her. Omar noticed the way her eyes lit up when she read, and he asked the castle librarian to stock an entire shelf with books chosen just for her. In return, Estella began reading out loud to him in the evenings. She stumbled over the words at first, but he listened patiently, his eyes full of quiet pride. These small rituals became the foundation of their bond, moments neither of them had ever thought they would have. The staff began to notice the change in her too. The shy, scared girl had become more confident, more alive. Her laugh echoed in the halls now, her footsteps no longer hesitant but assured. But healing, Estella learned, wasn't a straight path. One night, after a nightmare pulled her from sleep, she wandered into the hallways in tears, barefoot and trembling. In her dream, she had been back in her old house, Ricardo forcing her into a wedding dress, Mare whispering lies into her ear. The terror lingered even after she woke, gripping her chest like a vice. She found herself outside Omar's door, unsure of whether to knock. Before she could decide, he opened it. He must have heard her. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped aside and let her in. Estella sat on the edge of the bed, legs dangling, face buried in her hands. Omar sat next to her, offering no platitudes, no "you're safe now" speeches, just his presence. And that was enough. After a long while, she whispered, "What if I never stop being scared?" Omar placed a hand gently on her back. "Then I'll walk with you through every fear, as many times as it takes." Estella nodded slowly, her tears softening. That moment didn't erase the trauma, but it planted a new truth in her heart. She didn't have to face any of it alone ever again. The next big step came when Estella agreed to visit her mother's grave. Omar had prepared the site years ago, after finally learning of his daughter's fate, and he had kept it meticulously tended ever since. It sat on a quiet hill behind the castle grounds, surrounded by olive trees and soft white flowers that grew wild in the region. Estella held a small bouquet of fresh jasmine in her hands as they walked up the slope together, her heart pounding with each step. She didn't know what she would feel: anger, sorrow, emptiness. But as they reached the grave and she saw her mother's name etched into the marble, all she felt was longing. Longing for a hug she'd never received, a lullaby she'd never heard. Omar stood beside her in silence, giving her space to process. Estella kneeled down and placed the flowers at the base of the stone. "Hi, Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I wish I knew you." Her tears came freely, but for once she didn't hide them. She let herself mourn, not just her mother, but the years lost, the innocence stolen, the truth buried. Omar finally knelt beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulder. "She would be so proud of you," he said quietly. And Estella, despite everything, believed him. That visit to the grave marked a new beginning in Estella's journey. She began to speak more openly with Omar about her fears, her dreams, and the fragments of memories she carried. They went through old photo albums together, images of her mother as a child, then as a teenager, then as a young woman full of life and fire. Estella clung to those glimpses like puzzle pieces of an identity she was slowly piecing together. Omar even gave her a silver locket that had belonged to her mother, with a tiny picture inside. Her mother holding a baby, Estella, barely a few months old. That image shattered something in her, but also rebuilt something else. Proof that love had once existed between them, even if only for a fleeting moment. At night, she held the locket close to her chest, a silent promise to the woman who had brought her into the world. I'm still here, she would think, and I'll make this life count. She didn't know exactly what that would mean yet, whether she'd stay in the palace, return to Brazil one day, or build a new path entirely. But she knew one thing for certain. The story that had almost ended in a forced marriage was now her own to continue, and this time, no one would write it for her. As the months passed, Estella's transformation became impossible to ignore. She was no longer just the girl who had almost been sold into marriage. She was now known as the Sheikh's granddaughter, yes, but more importantly, as a young woman who had survived something unthinkable and come out stronger. Omar, once a closed-off figure known for his harsh demeanor, was now often seen smiling, especially when she was nearby. Their bond had softened him, and the people in the castle respected Estella not because of her title, but because of how she carried herself, with quiet resilience and genuine kindness. She spent time helping in the kitchen, learning from the staff, playing with children in the nearby village, and even started teaching a few of them basic Portuguese. I want them to know where I came from, she told Omar one day, even the painful parts. He simply nodded, understanding that she wasn't running from her past. She was integrating it, owning it, and that was something he admired deeply. Though she still had nightmares, still flinched at sudden loud voices, Estella was learning to live with the pain instead of letting it control her. She had been broken, yes, but not beyond repair. One particular afternoon, Estella was invited to speak at a private gathering organized by a local women's foundation. It was a quiet event, filled mostly with girls her age and their mothers. The theme was voices that were silenced and found again. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking was terrifying, especially about something so raw. But Omar encouraged her. Your story can help others, he told her gently, just as discovering it helped you. So she agreed. Wearing a simple white dress and the silver locket around her neck, she stood before the crowd and told her truth. She spoke of being taken, of being lied to, of being treated like property, and of the courage it took to speak a single word that changed everything. No. Her voice trembled at first, but as she looked into the eyes of the girls listening, some of them with tears on their cheeks, she stood taller. I thought I didn't matter, she said, but I do, and so do all of you. When she finished, the room was silent, not from discomfort, but from the weight of what had just been shared. Then came the applause, loud, emotional, real. Estella stepped down from the podium with her heart pounding, but not from fear. It was pride, and maybe, for the first time, a sense of purpose. That speech marked another turning point, not just for Estella, but for the community around her. Girls who had once stayed silent began speaking up, asking questions, sharing stories of their own. Omar watched this ripple effect with awe. He never expected that by searching for the granddaughter he had lost, he would end up becoming part of something larger. A quiet revolution started by a 13-year-old girl with a broken past and an unshakable will. Estella began working with counselors and teachers to create programs for other young girls, especially those at risk of exploitation. She didn't have all the answers, and sometimes she still felt overwhelmed by her own healing, but she knew she wasn't alone anymore. Every time she felt doubt creeping in, she would hold her locket, remember her mother's face, and take another step forward. Even Yusuf, once cold and distant, had started helping with her efforts, coordinating security and resources so the programs could grow. Estella was no longer a figure of pity. She was a symbol of resilience. People from nearby towns wrote letters thanking her, mothers named their newborn daughters after her, and young girls began referring to her not as the girl who was almost married off, but simply as Estella, the girl who said no and meant it. Despite the whirlwind of attention and the many changes in her life, Estella never let it cloud her sense of self. She still insisted on doing simple things, helping in the stables, sweeping her room, visiting the village markets without any fanfare. She said it helped her stay grounded, and Omar respected that. Their relationship, once filled with the awkward distance of strangers bound by blood, had evolved into something rich and mutual. He stopped calling her my legacy and started calling her just my granddaughter, which to Estella meant everything. One evening, while they sat in the castle's inner courtyard watching the stars, she turned to him and said, "You saved me." He shook his head and replied, "No, you saved yourself. I just gave you the space to do it." That night, Estella wrote in her journal for hours. She poured out her fears, her hopes, and the quiet but growing sense that maybe, just maybe, she was going to be okay. Her story had started with betrayal and fear, but it was becoming something else entirely. Something powerful, something hers. And though the road ahead was still long, she no longer feared walking it, because now she knew she belonged somewhere. And she had every intention of creating a future on her own terms. As her 14th birthday approached, Estella felt emotions she couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't excitement for gifts or parties, though Omar had quietly planned a modest celebration with her favorite pastries and a surprise visit from the librarian who had become a friend. What overwhelmed her most was the realization that this would be her first birthday celebrated in honesty. There were no lies, no strings attached, no secret agendas behind the smiles around her. Just real warmth, real intention. Omar gave her a handmade book, filled with old letters written by her mother when she was young, notes saved over the years and translated for Estella to read. Each letter opened a window into the woman who gave her life, and each page made Estella feel a little more whole. That evening, as candles glowed softly in the courtyard and the sound of laughter carried on the wind, she closed her eyes and made a wish, not for toys or wealth or fame, but for strength. Strength to keep healing, strength to forgive, strength to protect other girls who, like her, were never supposed to be statistics. And for the first time, the wish didn't feel like fantasy. It felt possible. After the birthday, Omar called for a private meeting with Estella in the same library where they had first begun to build trust. He handed her a file, thick with papers, documents, and a sealed envelope with her name handwritten on the front. "These are your records," he said. "Your real ones. Your name, your birth certificate, everything that was taken from you. It's yours again now." Estella opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a passport, a certificate of citizenship, and a small note in Omar's handwriting. "Whatever you choose next, it will be your choice." That gesture brought her to tears. So much of her life had been defined by other people's decisions. Ricardo's greed, Mayor's silence, the sheik's past regrets. But now, finally, the power to decide was hers. She held the documents to her chest like a key to a locked door she hadn't even realized she'd been waiting to open. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted. Omar smiled gently. "You don't have to. Just knowing that you can is enough." And it was. For the first time, Estella was no longer defined by what had happened to her. She was defined by what she would do next. Months later, Estella stood on the edge of the castle's garden, the same one where her nightmare had nearly begun. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, and the same torches that once lit the way to a forced marriage now cast a softer glow over a very different kind of gathering. This time, the garden wasn't filled with strangers judging her like an object on display. It was filled with people she had come to know and trust, friends from the village, girls from the programs she helped create, castle staff who had become like family. They were all there to support a new initiative, an education fund for girls who had been exploited or abandoned, named in honor of Estella's mother. As she took the small podium to speak, she glanced at Omar in the front row. His eyes were full of tears, but not the sorrowful kind. These were tears of pride. Estella cleared her throat, took a deep breath, and began. "A year ago, I thought my life was over," she said, her voice calm and clear. "But that day was just the beginning. I was stolen, I was lied to, but I found something stronger than all of that. I found truth, I found love, I found myself." The crowd stood in applause, but Estella barely heard it. Her heart was too full of something she'd never expected to feel in that very place, peace. Years from now, Estella would still find it hard to explain how everything changed so quickly, how one terrifying day became the turning point of her entire life. But some things don't need to be explained to be real. Even now, when she thinks back to that moment, standing in a wedding dress, trembling with tears in her eyes, she remembers the sound of her own voice, steady and brave, saying, "I don't want to marry you." That sentence, simple as it was, had shattered the illusion. It had cracked open the door to a truth far bigger than she ever imagined, that she was never meant to be a victim, that she had always been more than someone else's plan, that her voice had power, even when she felt powerless. Today, she walks freely through the castle she once feared. She travels, she learns. She tells her story not to relive the pain, but to prove that survival is only the beginning. And even though the scars remain and always will, Estella lives each day with a quiet, defiant joy. Because she is no longer the girl who was almost sold. She is the girl who was found, the girl who was claimed, the girl who chose herself. And that, more than any title or fortune, is what truly made her royalty.